The morning air was cold and sharp as David walked down Main Street, his boots making soft sounds on the wet pavement. In his jacket pocket, he carried a small wooden box that felt heavier than it should. Inside that box was something he never thought he would have to sell, his Bronze Star medal. David stopped in front of Miller's pawnshop and took a deep breath. The old building looked tired, with paint peeling from its walls and a flickering neon sign that buzzed in the quiet morning. Through the dusty window, he could see shelves filled with things that other people had once treasured: old guitars, jewelry, tools, and countless items that told stories of hard times. He had walked past this shop many times before, but never thought he would need to go inside. 3 years ago, when he came back from his last tour in Afghanistan, life seemed full of promise. He had his medal, his wife Lisa by his side, and plans for a simple, peaceful life. But life has a way of changing everything in an instant. 6 months ago, Lisa started feeling tired all the time. At first, they thought it was just stress from David's adjustment back to civilian life. But when she began losing weight and having trouble sleeping, they knew something was wrong. The doctor's words still echoed in David's mind like a bad dream. Cancer, stage 3? Treatment needed to start immediately. The medical bills started coming right away. Even with his veterans' benefits, the costs were overwhelming. The chemotherapy treatments cost more money than David made in 3 months at his part-time job at the hardware store. Lisa tried to stay strong, but he could see the worry in her eyes every time another bill arrived in the mail. First, they sold Lisa's car. It was hard to watch the tow truck take away the little blue sedan she had bought with her first paycheck from the library where she worked. Then went David's truck, the one he had saved for 2 years to buy. Next were Lisa's grandmother's dishes, the ones she had promised to pass down to their future children someday. One by one, everything valuable in their small apartment disappeared. David's tools from his construction days before the army, Lisa's jewelry including her mother's ring, even the television they had bought for their first anniversary. Each sale felt like losing a piece of their life together, but Lisa's health was more important than any possession. The worst part was watching Lisa try to hide how scared she was. She would smile when the nurses came in for her treatments, chat with other patients in the waiting room, and tell David that everything would be okay. But late at night, when she thought he was sleeping, he could hear her crying softly into her pillow. David had applied for extra financial help from veteran services, but the waiting list was long. He had asked his old army buddies for loans, but most of them were struggling too. His family lived far away and had their own problems. The local churches had helped what they could, but it wasn't enough to cover the ongoing treatments. Standing outside the pawn shop, David pulled the wooden box from his pocket and opened it slowly. The Bronze Star gleamed even in the gray morning light. He remembered the day he received it, standing in formation while the colonel read about how he had risked his life to save 3 wounded soldiers during a Taliban attack. His parents had been so proud. Lisa had cried happy tears. The citation was still in the box, folded carefully beside the medal. It talked about courage and sacrifice, about going beyond the call of duty. David had read those words so many times, but now they felt like they were about someone else. How could he be courageous when he couldn't even take care of his own wife? A couple walked past him on the sidewalk, and David quickly closed the box. He didn't want anyone to see what he was about to do. In his small town, everyone knew everyone, and he couldn't bear the thought of people talking about how the local war hero had to sell his medal to pay bills. The bell above the door made a soft chiming sound as David finally pushed his way into the pawn shop. The smell hit him immediately: old leather, dust, and something that reminded him of his grandfather's attic. Shelves lined every wall, packed with items that seemed to have stories of their own. Wedding rings sat in a glass case next to old pocket watches. Musical instruments hung from hooks on the ceiling. Power tools were stacked in one corner, and boxes of books filled another. David had never been inside a pawn shop before. Growing up, his father had always said that good people didn't need to sell their belongings to strangers. But his father had never faced medical bills that kept growing no matter how many payments they made. Behind the counter stood an older man with gray hair and kind eyes. He was carefully cleaning an antique clock, his weathered hands moving with practiced skill. When he looked up and saw David, he smiled warmly. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" David's mouth felt dry. He had practiced what he would say, but now the words seemed stuck in his throat. He walked slowly to the counter, his hand gripping the metal box so tight his knuckles were white. I need to sell something," David finally managed to say. His voice barely above a whisper, the shop owner set down the clock and gave David his full attention. There was something about the way the man looked at him, not judging, not pushy, just patient and understanding. David had seen that look before from other veterans who understood what it meant to carry heavy burdens. "Take your time," the shop owner said gently. "What do you have there?" David placed the wooden box on the counter between them. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hoped the older man didn't notice. This was it, the moment when he would have to let go of the one thing that proved he had done something meaningful with his life. The box sat there on the counter like a bridge between his past and his present. On one side was the young soldier who had earned recognition for his bravery. On the other side was a man who would do anything to save the woman he loved, even if it meant selling the proof of the most important thing he had ever done. David looked around the shop one more time, at all the other items that had once meant everything to someone else. Soon, his metal would join them, becoming just another object on a shelf. Waiting for someone who could afford to buy a piece of someone else's history, he took a deep breath and prepared to open the box, knowing that once he did, there would be no going back. The man behind the counter had the kind of face that told stories without saying a word. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of years spent looking at life from both sides, the good and the bad. His name was Frank, and he had owned this little pawn shop for almost 30 years. But what David didn't know was that Frank's story went much deeper than just buying and selling other people's belongings. Frank had seen it all in his shop. Young mothers selling wedding rings to buy baby formula, college students pawning laptops to make rent, elderly people bringing in family heirlooms when Social Security wasn't enough. Each transaction told a story of struggle, hope, or sometimes just survival. Frank had learned long ago not to judge anyone who walked through his door, but there was something about the young man standing in front of him that made Frank pay closer attention. Maybe it was the way David held himself, straight back, shoulders square like someone used to following orders. Or maybe it was the look in his eyes, the same look Frank remembered seeing in his own mirror many years ago. Frank had been just 19 when he was sent to Korea in 1952. Back then, he thought, he knew everything about life. 2 years later, when he came home, he realized he knew nothing at all. The war had changed him in ways he couldn't explain to his family or friends. They would ask about his experiences, but how could he tell them about the friends he lost? The cold that never seemed to leave his bones, or the nightmares that woke him up screaming. When Frank first opened his pawn shop, it was just supposed to be a way to make money. He had tried working in factories and offices, but he always felt trapped indoors. The pawn shop gave him freedom to be his own boss and work with his hands. Over the years, though, it became something more. It became a place where people came when they had nowhere else to turn. Frank learned to read people quickly. He could tell the difference between someone who was selling something because they wanted to upgrade, and someone who was selling because they had no choice. The desperate ones always held their items differently, tighter, like they were afraid to let go. They spoke more quietly, looked around nervously, and often apologized for taking up his time. David was definitely one of the desperate ones. "I've been running this place for a long time," Frank said, setting down his cleaning cloth. "I've learned that every item that comes through that door has a story. Some stories are happy people selling things they've outgrown or don't need anymore, but some stories—" He paused and looked directly at David. "Some stories are harder to hear." David shifted uncomfortably, still gripping the wooden box. He had expected this to be a simple business transaction. Bring in the metal, get some money, leave. But Frank wasn't treating this like a normal sale. "You look like you've got something important in that box," Frank continued. "And you look like a man who doesn't want to be here." I don't, David admitted, his voice cracking slightly. But I don't have any other choice. Frank nodded slowly. In all his years of business, he had heard those exact words hundreds of times. But coming from this young man, they hit differently. Frank could see the military bearing, the careful way David scanned the room when he entered, the disciplined way he stood even when he was clearly uncomfortable. You served, didn't you? Frank asked quietly. David looked surprised. How did you know? Takes one to know one, Frank replied with a sad smile. Korea, myself. Long time ago, but some things you never forget. The tension in David's shoulders seemed to ease slightly. He hadn't expected to find another veteran in this dusty little shop. Somehow, it made what he was about to do feel a little less shameful. Frank had recognized the signs immediately. The way David checked the exits when he entered. The way he positioned himself where he could see the whole room. The respectful but guarded way he approached the counter. These were habits that soldiers learned and never fully lost, even years after. Coming home, where did you serve? Frank asked, not pushing, just showing interest. Afghanistan, 3 tours, David replied. Got back about 3 years ago, Frank whistled softly. 3 tours. That's serious business. He had read enough about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to know that soldiers were being sent back again. And again, much more than in his day. How are you adjusting to being back? David almost laughed, but it came out bitter instead. Not great, obviously, or I wouldn't be here. Frank understood that feeling all too well. Coming home from war was supposed to be the happy ending, but for many soldiers, it was just the beginning of a different kind of battle. Frank remembered his own struggles, the jobs that didn't work out, the relationships that fell apart, the feeling that he didn't quite fit anywhere anymore. The adjustment is tough, Frank said. People think that once you're home, everything should go back to normal. But there's no normal to go back to. You're different, the world's different, and nobody really understands that except other people who've been there. David looked at Frank with new respect. Here was someone who actually got it. Most people thanked him for his service and then changed the subject as quickly as possible. They didn't want to hear about the real challenges of coming home. Frank had built his business on understanding people, but veterans held a special place in his heart. Over the years, several had come into his shop during tough times. Frank always tried to help when he could, sometimes paying more than items were worth, sometimes offering payment plans that made no business sense. His accountant thought he was crazy, but Frank knew what it felt like to need help and have nowhere to turn. I've seen a lot of soldiers come through here over the years, Frank said. Usually means something's gone wrong on the home front. Medical bills, divorce, job troubles. The transition isn't easy, and nobody prepares you for how hard civilian life can be. David felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had been holding everything together for so long, trying to be strong for Lisa, trying to figure out solutions on his own. Having someone acknowledge how difficult things were made all his emotions threatened to spill over. My wife, David said, his voice barely audible. She's sick, really sick, and the bills. He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank's heart sank. He had guessed it was something serious, but hearing it confirmed made him feel angry at a system that let heroes struggle alone. Frank had been lucky. He had come home healthy, found work, built a life. But he knew too many veterans who hadn't been so fortunate. I'm sorry to hear that, Frank said sincerely. That's a heavy load to carry. David appreciated that Frank didn't offer empty reassurances or tell him everything would work out. Sometimes the most helpful thing someone can do is simply acknowledge that life is hard. Frank looked at the wooden box David was still holding and made a decision. Whatever was in that box, he was going to handle this transaction with the respect and dignity that this young veteran deserved. Frank had spent decades building his reputation on fair dealing, but some situations called for more than just fairness. Why don't you show me what you've got, Frank said gently, and take your time. We're not in any hurry here. David's hands trembled as he slowly opened the wooden box. The bronze star caught the light from the shop's overhead bulbs, its bronze surface gleaming against the dark velvet lining. Frank had seen many valuable items in his decades of business, but he immediately recognized this wasn't just any piece of jewelry or collectible. This was something earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen a bronze star up close before, though he knew what they represented. In Korea, he had served alongside men who performed acts of incredible bravery, but most of them never received formal recognition. Seeing one now, in his own shop, brought back a flood of memories he usually kept buried deep. "May I?" Frank asked quietly, gesturing toward the medal. David nodded, unable to speak. Watching Frank carefully lift the bronze star from its case felt like watching his entire military career being examined by a stranger. The medal seemed so small in Frank's weathered hands, yet David knew it represented the most important moment of his life. Frank turned the medal over slowly, reading the inscription on the back. "Bronze Star Medal for Meritorious Achievement. In ground operations against hostile forces," he read aloud. Then he picked up the citation that was folded beneath the medal and began to read. David's story. The citation described events that happened on a dusty afternoon in Afghanistan's Helmand province. David and his squad had been on a routine patrol when they were ambushed by Taliban fighters hiding in a compound. The attack was sudden and devastating. 3 of David's fellow soldiers were wounded immediately, trapped in an open area with no cover while enemy fire rained down on them. According to the citation, David had crawled through hostile fire not once, but 3 separate times to reach his wounded comrades. The first soldier had taken shrapnel to his leg and couldn't walk. David dragged him to safety behind a concrete wall, then immediately went back for the second man who had been shot in the shoulder. By the time David reached the third soldier, enemy fire had intensified, and the wounded man was barely conscious from blood loss. Frank read how David had shielded the third soldier with his own body while calling for medical evacuation, staying exposed to enemy fire for nearly 20 minutes until backup arrived. The citation stated that David's exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty had saved 3 lives and reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Army. When Frank finished reading, he looked up to find David staring at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. The young veteran's face was a mix of pride and pain, remembering a day that had changed his life forever. "Tell me about that day," Frank said softly. David took a deep breath. He rarely talked about Afghanistan with anyone, not even Lisa. Most people wanted to hear war stories that sounded like movies, with clear heroes and villains and happy endings, but real war wasn't like that. Real war was messy and complicated, and left scars that never fully healed. "It all happened so fast," David began, his voice distant. "One minute we were walking down this dusty road, talking about home and what we were going to eat for dinner, and the next minute bullets were flying everywhere. My first thought wasn't about being brave or earning medals. I just saw my friends getting hurt, and I couldn't leave them there." Frank nodded, understanding the weight behind those simple words. In his experience, real heroes never set out to be heroes. They just did what needed to be done when the moment called for it. "The first guy, Rodriguez, he was maybe 20 feet away from cover when he got hit," David continued. "The bullet hit his leg and he was screaming. Not from pain, but from frustration. He kept trying to crawl toward us, but he couldn't put any weight on that leg, so I went to get him." David paused, his hands opening and closing into fists as he remembered. The second time wasn't too bad. Johnson had taken shrapnel in his shoulder, but he was still alert. He even joked about getting a Purple Heart while I was dragging him to safety. Frank could see that talking about this was difficult for David, but he sensed the young man needed to tell someone who would understand. "The third time, David's voice broke slightly. "That was for Wilson. He was the youngest guy in our unit, just 19 years old. Kid from Ohio who joined the Army too. Pay for college. When I reached him, he was unconscious and bleeding bad." "Really bad? I thought I was going to lose him right there." The shop fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock Frank had been cleaning earlier. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the emotion he couldn't hide. I stayed with Wilson until the medics came. Felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes. Bullets hitting the ground all around us. I kept talking to him, telling him about his girlfriend back home, about how he was going to make it through this and get that college degree. I wasn't sure if he could hear me, but I kept talking anyway. Frank felt his own eyes getting wet. He had been in similar situations during his time in Korea, watching young men fight for their lives while other young men risked everything to save them. "Did he make it?" Frank asked quietly. David smiled for the first time since entering the shop. "He did, lost a lot of blood, spent months in recovery, but he made it. He's actually in college now, studying to be a teacher. Sends me a card every Christmas. And the other two?" "Rodriguez walks with a slight limp, but he's doing great. Married his high school sweetheart last year. Johnson went back to his family's farm in Iowa. They're all doing well." David's voice carried both pride and sadness. "Better than me, anyway." Frank understood that guilt. Survivor's guilt was something many veterans carried. The feeling that they didn't deserve to come home when others didn't, or that they didn't deserve recognition when so many acts of bravery went unnoticed. "You saved 3 lives that day," Frank said firmly. "That's not something small. That's everything to those men and their families." "I know," David replied. "And I'm proud of what I did, but that medal—" He gestured toward the Bronze Star lying on the counter. "It's supposed to represent honor and service. How can I sell that? What kind of man sells his Bronze Star?" The question hung in the air between them. Frank had heard similar words from other veterans who had come to his shop over the years. The shame of having to sell something that represented their service, their sacrifice, their finest moments. "A man who loves his wife more than his pride," Frank said after a long pause. "A man who's willing to sacrifice anything to save the person who matters most to him." David looked up, surprised by Frank's response. "You want to know what kind of man sells his Bronze Star?" Frank continued. "The same kind of man who earns one in the first place. Someone who puts other people before himself, no matter what it costs him." David felt the tears coming again. He had been carrying the shame of this decision for weeks, feeling like he was betraying everything he had fought for. Hearing Frank frame it differently made him see his situation from a new angle. "My wife, Lisa," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's everything to me. We met right after I got back from my second tour. She helped me adjust to being home, dealt with my nightmares, stood by me when I was struggling to find work. When I deployed for the 3rd time, she waited for me. And now she needs you to fight for her the way you fought for your soldiers." Frank finished. David nodded, unable to speak. That was exactly how he felt, like Lisa was trapped in hostile territory and he was the only one who could save her. Frank stared at the Bronze Star for a long moment, his mind racing. In 30 years of running his pawn shop, he had never faced a situation quite like this. He had bought and sold thousands of items, each with their own story, but nothing had ever hit him this deeply. The medal represented everything he respected about military service: courage, sacrifice, and putting others before yourself, but this wasn't just about the medal anymore. This was about a young veteran who had already given so much for his country and was now being forced to give up even more just to save his wife's life. Frank thought about all the politicians who gave speeches about supporting veterans, all the people who said, "Thank you for your service," and then went on with their lives. Where were they when veterans like David needed real help? David stood quietly, waiting for Frank to make an offer. He had no idea what a Bronze Star might be worth on the collector's market. He had looked online but found wildly different prices. Some were selling for a few $100s, others for thousands. He hoped it would be enough to cover at least one more round of Lisa's chemotherapy treatments. Frank carefully placed the medal back in its case and closed the lid. The soft click of the box closing seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet shop. David held his breath, preparing himself to hear a number that might determine whether Lisa could continue her treatment. "I can't take this," Frank said quietly. David's heart sank. His face crumpled as he assumed Frank was rejecting his medal, maybe because it wasn't worth as much as he had hoped. "Please," David said, his voice breaking. "I know it might not be worth much to most people, but it's all I have left." "I'll take whatever you can offer." Frank held up his hand gently. "No, son, you don't understand. I can't take this medal, not. Because it's not valuable, it's priceless. I can't take it because it belongs with you. It belongs with the man who earned it." David stared at Frank in confusion. This wasn't how pawnshop transactions were supposed to go. Frank was supposed to examine the item, make an offer, and complete the sale. David needed money, not speeches about honor and valor. "I don't understand," David said. "I need to sell this. My wife needs that money for her treatment." Frank reached into his cash register and pulled out a thick envelope that he kept hidden under the cash tray. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed it on the counter next to David's medal case. "My grandson Danny came back from Iraq 5 years ago," Frank said, his voice growing emotional. He was 22 years old on his first deployment. His convoy hit an improvised explosive device outside Baghdad. The truck flipped over, caught fire, and Danny was trapped inside with a broken leg. David listened intently, not sure where Frank was going with this story. "Another soldier risked his life to pull Danny out of that burning truck," Frank continued. "I don't know that soldier's name. I don't know what he looked like or where he came from. But I know that Danny is alive today because someone like you was willing to risk everything for a fellow soldier." Frank's eyes filled with tears as he spoke. "Danny came home. He got married last year to his college sweetheart. They're expecting their first baby in the spring. That young man has a whole life ahead of him because another soldier chose to be brave when it mattered most." David felt a chill run down his spine. He was beginning to understand why Frank couldn't take his medal. "For 5 years I've been carrying around a debt I couldn't repay," Frank said. "Every night I thank God that Danny made it home. And every night I wonder about the soldier who saved him. I wonder if he made it home too. I wonder if he's struggling, if he needs help, if there's anything I could do to repay what he did for my family." Frank pushed the envelope closer to David. "I've been saving this money for years, waiting for the right moment, the right way to say thank you to the kind of soldier who saved my grandson. I never thought that moment would come, but here you are." David looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "I can't take your money. I came here to sell something, not to ask for charity." "This isn't charity," Frank said firmly. "This is one veteran helping another. This is a grandfather repaying a debt to the kind of man who saved his grandson's life. This is what we do for each other." Frank had been thinking about this moment for months, even before David walked into his shop. Danny's wedding day had been wonderful, but it had also reminded Frank of how close they had come to losing him. Frank had made a promise to himself. That day, if he ever had the chance to help a veteran in need, he wouldn't hesitate. "How much is in there?" David asked quietly. $3,000, Frank replied. "It's everything I've saved over the past few years. I was keeping it for emergencies, but this feels like the right emergency to me." David's legs felt weak. $3,000 would cover almost 2 months of Lisa's treatments. It would give them breathing room to figure out what to do next. But taking money from this kind stranger felt wrong, even if Frank was offering it freely. "I can't accept this," David said, even though every fiber of his being wanted to grab that envelope and run straight to the hospital. "You don't even know me. You don't owe me anything." Frank smiled sadly. "I know enough about you. I know you earned this medal by risking your life for others. I know you're here trying to sell the thing you're most proud of to save your wife. I know you're the kind of man who puts other people first, just like the soldier who saved Danny." Frank had seen enough people in desperate situations to recognize genuine need. David wasn't trying to scam him or take advantage of his kindness. This was a good man facing an impossible situation, the kind of situation that could break anyone. "Besides," Frank added, "I'm not just giving you this money. I'm making you a deal. You keep your medal, and I get to sleep better at night knowing I finally found a way to say thank you to a soldier who understands what it means to risk everything for someone else." David picked up the envelope with trembling hands. It felt heavier than the metal case, weighted with the kindness of a stranger who understood the bonds that connect all veterans. "I don't know what to say," David whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Frank replied. "Just take care of your wife. Help her get better. And maybe someday, when you meet another veteran who needs help, you'll remember this moment and pay it forward." David thought about Lisa, probably sitting in their apartment right now, worried about how they were going to pay for her next treatment. He thought about the relief on her face when he told her they had found a way to continue her care. He thought about having a little more time to figure out a long-term solution. "There's one condition," Frank said. "Your medal stays with you. The Bronze Star goes home with you today, and it stays there. That's not negotiable." David nodded, tears streaming down his face. He had come into this shop prepared to sell the symbol of his greatest achievement. Instead, he was leaving with both his medal and the money he desperately needed. Frank walked around the counter and embraced David like a father hugging his son. Two veterans from different wars and different generations, connected by the understanding that some debts can only be repaid by helping others. "Thank you," David managed to say through his tears. "Thank you," Frank replied, "for your service, for what you did for those soldiers in Afghanistan, and for giving me the chance to finally say thank you to someone who understands what it means to serve." As David prepared to leave the shop, Frank made him promise to come back and let him know how Lisa was doing. David agreed, knowing he had just experienced something that would change his life forever. David walked out of Miller's pawn shop feeling like he was in a dream. The envelope in his jacket pocket seemed to weigh nothing and everything at the same time. He kept touching it to make sure it was real, that the past hour had actually happened. In his other pocket, the Bronze Star medal rested safely in its wooden case, where Frank had insisted it belonged. The cold morning air hit his face, but David barely noticed. His mind was racing with thoughts of Lisa, of how her face would look when he told her they could continue her treatment. For the first time in months, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. David's hands shook as he pulled out his phone to call Lisa. She answered on the second ring, her voice weak but trying to sound cheerful. "Hey, honey, how did it go?" she asked, though David could hear the worry underneath her words. "Lisa," David said, his voice breaking with emotion, "we're going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay." He told her about Frank, about the grandson who had been saved in Iraq, about the envelope full of money that would cover her treatments. Lisa cried on the other end of the phone, not from sadness this time, but from pure relief and gratitude. That afternoon, David and Lisa went to the hospital together. Dr. Peterson, Lisa's oncologist, had been worried about their financial situation. He had seen too many patients forced to stop treatment because they couldn't afford it. When David handed him the payment for the next 2 months of chemotherapy, Dr. Peterson smiled wider than they had seen in weeks. "This is wonderful news," Dr. Peterson said. "We can continue with the treatment plan without any delays. Your latest tests have been encouraging, Lisa. I really think we're making progress." 3 days later, David returned to the pawn shop. He wanted to thank Frank again and to give him an update on Lisa's condition. When he walked through the door, Frank looked up from organizing some jewelry in the display case and smiled warmly. "David, how's Lisa doing?" "She started her next round of treatment yesterday," David replied. "The doctors are optimistic. They think the cancer is responding well to the chemotherapy." Frank's face lit up with genuine joy. "That's the best news I've heard all week." David pulled out a small envelope from his pocket. "I wanted to give you this. It's not much, but it's a start." Inside the envelope was $200 and a handwritten note. Frank read the note silently, his eyes growing misty. It was a simple thank you, but the words came straight from David's heart. "You don't owe me anything," Frank said, trying to give the envelope back. "Yes, I do," David replied firmly. "Not just the money, though I will pay back every penny. I owe you something much bigger than that. You gave me back my faith in people. You showed me that there are still good people in the world who care about strangers." Word about what Frank had done began to spread through their small town. David hadn't intended to tell anyone, but when Lisa's sister asked how they were managing to continue the treatments, Lisa couldn't help but share the story of the kind pawnshop owner who had helped them. Lisa's sister told her husband, who told his co-workers at the factory. One of those co-workers mentioned it to his wife, who was active in their church. Before long, the story of the veteran who almost sold his Bronze Star and the shop owner who wouldn't let him had reached dozens of people throughout the community. What happened next surprised everyone, especially Frank and David on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after David's first visit to the pawnshop. Frank arrived at his store to find a small crowd gathered outside. At first, he worried something was wrong. Then he saw Mrs. Chung from the flower shop next door holding a coffee can with a handwritten sign that read Lisa's Treatment Fund. "What's all this?" Frank asked, confused. "We heard about what you did for David and his wife," Mrs. Chung explained. "The whole neighborhood is talking about it. People want to help." Throughout that day, a steady stream of visitors came to the pawnshop. Some were customers Frank had known for years. Others were complete strangers who had heard the story. Each person brought something, a few dollars, a $20 bill, sometimes more. An elderly man who had served in Vietnam brought $50 and a note saying he understood what it meant to struggle after coming home from war. The local newspaper picked up the story after a reporter heard about it from her neighbor. The article was simple and honest, focusing on the kindness Frank had shown and the community's response. It didn't mention David's last name or include any photos, respecting the family's privacy during a difficult time, but the article did something unexpected. It inspired people from neighboring towns to drive to Miller's pawnshop with donations. A veterans organization from the county seat brought an envelope with $800 they had collected at their monthly meeting. A group of military wives who had read the story online organized a bake sale and brought the proceeds to Frank. Frank was overwhelmed. He had given David $3,000 as a simple act of gratitude, never expecting it to become something bigger. Every donation that came in was carefully recorded and stored in a safe behind the counter. Frank insisted that every penny would go directly to David and Lisa. 2 weeks after the story broke, Frank called David to come to the shop. When David arrived, Frank led him to the back office where a large manila envelope sat on the desk. "I need you to sit down for this," Frank said, his voice excited but nervous. David sat down, unsure what to expect. "The community has raised money for Lisa's treatment," Frank began. "More money than I ever imagined possible." He handed David the envelope. Inside was a check for $12,000, along with dozens of cards and letters from people they had never met. David stared at the check in disbelief. $12,000? He whispered. $12,437, to be exact, Frank said with a grin. "That should cover all of Lisa's treatments for the rest of her therapy, plus some extra for other expenses." David couldn't speak. He read through some of the cards, each one containing messages of support and encouragement. Some were from other veterans, some from cancer survivors, and many from ordinary people who had simply been moved by their story. One card stood out. It was from an elderly woman named Betty who wrote, "My husband served in World War II. He always said that we take care of our own. You and your wife are part of our community now, and we take care of our community." Frank watched David read through the cards, remembering his own amazement as donations had poured in day after day. He had seen the best of human nature in action, watching people who had never met David or Lisa open their hearts and wallets to help. "There's something else," Frank said. "Dr. Peterson called me yesterday. He wanted to thank the community for their support. He said Lisa's response to treatment has been remarkable. The tumors are shrinking faster than expected." David looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Really? Really?" He said if she continues to respond this well, she might be able to finish treatment earlier than originally planned. That evening, David and Lisa sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by all the cards and letters from their newfound extended family. Lisa was having a good day, her color better than it had been in months. The latest round of chemotherapy was Working, and for the first time since her diagnosis, they both felt genuinely optimistic about the future. "I can't believe all these people care about us," Lisa said, holding a card from a group of school children who had organized a penny drive. "It all started with Frank," David replied. "One person deciding to help changed everything." David thought about the Bronze Star medal, now sitting proudly on their mantelpiece where it belonged. He had gone to that pawn shop prepared to sell the symbol of his greatest achievement. Instead, he had discovered something even more valuable: the power of human kindness to create miracles. 6 months later, Lisa finished her last chemotherapy treatment. The cancer was in complete remission. David had returned to school to study nursing, inspired by the care Lisa had received and wanting to help other families facing similar battles. Frank still ran his pawn shop, but it had become something more than just a business. It had become a symbol of what happens when good people decide to help each other. And every time David visited, which was often, Frank reminded him that sometimes the best investments aren't in things you can sell, but in connections you can make with other human beings.